Welcome to the role of media in building trust in the democratic process. I'm Trevor Potter, president of Campaign Legal Center. Thank you all for joining us. CLC is a national nonpartisan organization working to advance democracy through law at the federal, state, and local levels. We fight for every American's right to participate in the democratic process. We believe our democracy should be transparent, accountable, and inclusive. Last year, CLC and the Ad Council Research Institute released findings from a study which found that 66% of conservative voters and 46% of independent voters lack confidence in U.S. elections. Overall, the study found that voters' distrust is exacerbated by a lack of knowledge about the electoral process itself, including what happens after they cast their ballot. But there are reasons to be optimistic. By drawing attention to the nuts and bolts of our electoral process, we can help increase knowledge and change attitudes and behaviors among this demographic of voters. This is especially true when the information comes from reliable, trusted local news sources. Unfortunately, traditional newsrooms are disappearing across the country, particularly in rural areas, where over 1/5 of Americans currently live in what are called news deserts, with little or no access to local news sources. At the same time, bad actors are working to undermine confidence in our elections and manipulate election results for their own political gain. So-called election deniers frequently make false or misleading claims about how elections work, sowing distrust among voters and threatening the very fabric of our democracy. In this environment, journalists are navigating the onslaught of misinformation and disinformation surrounding our electoral process in a whole new way, sometimes on a shoestring budget. The panelists joining us today will discuss the state of journalism and what this means for how voters understand elections in their states. I'd like to now turn things over to our moderator for today, Sandhya Batheja, Vice President of Communications at CLC, introduce the members of today's panel and get us started. Sandhya?
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Trevor. Thanks so much. Before we start our discussion today, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. During our conversation, please use the comment section on Facebook or YouTube and submit your questions for members of the panel. At the end of the panel, we will start the question and answer section, and we're going to do our best to get to every question, but in the interest of time, we might not be able to get to all of them. And if that's the case, please, if you are a member of the public, please send questions to info@campaignlegal.org. If you are a member of the press, please send questions to media@campaignlegal.org. And so now that we've done those couple of housekeeping announcements, I'd love to introduce you to our wonderful panelists today and appreciate all of their time in being with us this afternoon. I'm going to actually ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves because they have very amazing and extensive bios, and I think that me reading them on screen would not do all of them justice. So first, I'd like to welcome Mary Jo Pitzel, who's a senior reporter at the Arizona Republic in Arizona Central. So Mary Jo would love to hear a little bit about you and your experience in covering elections over the years.
Thanks so much, Sandhya. Yes, I'm currently covering state government here in Phoenix for the Arizona Republic. As you know, Arizona has increasingly become a swing state. We are expecting hordes of out-of-state media in the next year, given our very competitive Senate race, as well as Arizona's stake in the presidential race. I should also mention, though, that our state legislature has the potential to shift from Republican control, which has been pretty much unanimous since 1966 to Democrat. A lot of water will have to go under the bridge before we get to that, but the legislative elections will also be very pivotal. I've been a reporter at the Arizona Republic for longer than before the internet age, let's put it that way. And I've covered a variety of beats. But most recently, I've spent a lot of time doing state government. I am an alum of our famous so-called audit that happened after the 2020 election, and we'll have some more to say about that later on.
Thank you, Mary Jo. Thanks for being here. Our next panelist is Jason Acorn, the Vice President of Growth of Investments at the American Journalism Project. Thank you, Jason, for being here, and would love to hear about your background and a little bit about the American Journalism Project.
Yeah, thank you for having us for today's conversation. The American Journalism Project is the first ever venture philanthropy dedicated to nonprofit local news. So we were founded in 2019. Since then, we've built a portfolio of 41 nonprofit local news organizations across the country, from Puerto Rico to Montana to Mississippi. We've helped launch new newsrooms in West Virginia, in Cleveland, Ohio, in Houston, Texas, in Wichita, Kansas. And we do three things. We make grants, growth investments, which is the portfolio that I do most of my work with, to help nonprofit local news organizations grow to meet the needs of their communities. We work with communities to launch new nonprofit newsrooms, and we do kind of close coaching and venture support to leadership teams of nonprofit local news organizations to help them better understand the needs of their communities when it comes to local news and information and how they can increase their impact.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for being here, and looking forward to hearing about your experience in the conversation. And last, I'd love to introduce Scott Elliott. He's the Chief Executive Officer for Piedmont Media and publisher of 2 Virginia newspapers. So welcome, Scott, and would love to hear a little bit about your background.
Thank you. Yes, I was a newspaper reporter most of my life in Dayton, Ohio, and at the Indianapolis Star. In 2013, I left to be the founding bureau chief of a nonprofit news organization, Chalkbeat. I was their Chalkbeat, Indiana founding bureau chief. And then I came here to Northern Virginia earlier this year. I covered elections. I mostly covered education, but of course there are elections in education, but covered elections going all the way back to my earliest days in a small newspaper, just like the ones I now lead. And we just had a big local election year here in Virginia that included influence from the national narrative, which I'm sure we can discuss here.
Thank you, Scott. And I just want to mention that for those who saw our promotions, Grace Ashford was to join us for this panel today, but unfortunately, because she is a reporter, she was called into doing reporting on urgent issues. So fortunately, she won't be here today, but thank you to everyone for joining us. So let's just jump right in. I'd love to start with Mary Jo with a question for you. Based on your experience, what do you think, broadly speaking, the role of journalism is in a functioning democracy? You're on mute.
Probably sound better that way. I think in a nutshell, it's the role of journalism is to tell people what their government is doing, or in some cases not doing. That's the prime mission. And it's an informative role. We want to tell people how their government, what they're doing, and what governmental policies, how they affect people's everyday lives, how it affects maybe the bigger picture. What are the consequences of this road being built here, or of this, if this person were to become governor. And it's also to expose, in all senses of the word, both to lay out what's happening, but also to dig out things that maybe people don't want you to know of what's happening behind the scenes.
Scott or Jason, anything to add?
I would add to that, and I agree with all of that, Mary Jo. Yeah, I think about it from, what does it take for the public, for communities to be active participants in democracy? And when you look at that, it's, people need to know what's going on, what the problems are, and they need to be kind of equipped and empowered to do something about that. And the overlap between those needs that a democratic society has and what local news in particular does, just as kind of one-to-one. Local news is what helps people identify what the problems are and gives them the tools and information to step up and do something about that. And so, I really believe, and I think this group does, which is really exciting because we're having this conversation that local news is essential to the future of our democracy.
And I would just say, I mean, we should be the umpire. We should be a independent arbiter, somebody who's for whom there's basic trust in their purpose as trying to be a independent third party that tells it like it is and calls balls and strikes. And in the best games, you don't notice the umpire. You just understand everything that's happening as it's happening. So that's what I think we should be trying to do.
Absolutely. Part of what we're seeing with the media is a lot of polarization, and readers and Americans generally have lost trust in a lot of news sources that maybe once were seen as the go-to news sources that everyone kind of de facto trusted. What role do you see in journalists combating this and kind of bringing back and building trust in the democratic process, and specifically to the democratic process, but in general to, get readership trust once again? And maybe start with you, Jason.
Yeah, and you talked about kind of polarization and trust. Knight Gallup had some polling come out earlier this year. It showed twice as many Americans trust their local news outlets as they do national news outlets. They have concerns about the motivations and kind of what's behind national news, whereas local news is, the reporters are their neighbors and they're showing up to city council meetings and school board meetings, and there's a level of trust there that still does persist even as national trust in national media goes down. I think there's the two things I'd point to about kind of the role of building trust in a democratic process around local news in particular. One is that when local news outlets disappear, we have an increasing body of research that does show kind of polarization go up. So researchers have found that single party voting goes up. People vote on parties, not issues and candidates, when you don't have access to high quality local news. You see social attitudes towards those who have different political views get worse when you don't have a local news outlet anymore. And you see actual decreases in voter participation rates and civic engagement when local news outlets, newspapers shut down. And almost 2,000 newspapers have shut down over the last 15 years. So no surprise that we're seeing some of these big trends across the country. On the other hand, quickly, there's positive effects when we do rebuild local news. So local news mitigates that polarization by talking about the issues that people care about most, of being responsive to those issues and understanding what they are, and it can empower readers to do something to hold those in power to account. It can cover public meetings. It can showcase. It can just put those in power under a spotlight, and that has really positive effects for trust and civic engagement.
I would agree that, again, with like everything that Jason has said, it's important to have a dialogue with people. I mean, here in Arizona, especially with recent election cycles, there is a distinct disdain for a lot of our coverage. They feel that, it all leans in one direction because we're telling them, for example, that the audit that was done of the 2020 presidential election here, it didn't really audit anything, and it didn't uncover wrongdoing, and people don't want to hear that, but it's the truth, and it's what is backed up by fact, and attempts to try to have some kind of a conversation or to acknowledge that there are contrary views I don't know how much that helps build trust, but at least it shows that that there's a venue for a dialogue. And I think that's important, to not shut out totally people who look at things very differently.
And I would just add, in terms of the actual work, it always starts for me with demonstrating excellence and independence in the reporting. The very first thing you need to do is really do good work and know that you got your facts straight and don't get things wrong. And also constantly check yourself for bias. Check with your reporters. You really do have to talk about it all the time. You have to talk about it all the time, like, are we being fair to that guy? Are we being fair to that to the woman who's running for that office? Did we give the criticism of her a fair consideration from their opponent, even though their opponent was being very nasty, for example? You know what I mean? I think you have to really do those sort of like nuts and bolts things in the work as a first way of demonstrating trust to your.
Thank you. It's getting more and more complicated, I think, to demonstrate to people that, these are the facts. And so, it kind of leads me to my next question, and I'll start with Mary Jo. You mentioned that you've been covering elections for quite some time. If you can talk about kind of how your coverage has changed, how the coverage has changed over the years, and how things have shifted, and how you've kind of met those challenges. Obviously, maybe start with things before 2020, and how, coverage went versus in a post-2020 world, with what you've experienced in your reporting.
Sure. I think probably the starkest difference before 2020, although there were always questions about, like, especially in Arizona, where we have a lot of mail-in voting, a lot of questions about, well, why is it taking so long to get results back? We have always done explanation of that, but that really shot way up with readers and the general public after 2020. So we spend more time now talking about the process of elections. We have a reporter who's basically, she's going to spend a lot of her time just writing stories about, here's what you can and can't do with a drop box. Here are the deadlines for registration. Here's the deadline for getting your ballot back. Just a lot of, almost hand holding, but they're very useful guides. So post 2020, it's just been a lot more attention to the detail. Sort of on the broader scene, I would also say, if you look around, there are democracy beats all over the place. You have reporters who have been assigned to democracy coverage, which, basically covers the electoral process. And there's been a real growth in that. Vote Beat, which I think is a sister publication of Chalk Beat, they opened an outpost here in Arizona last year because of what they saw happening in our elections. Also, we are spending more time covering litigation because there are more lawsuits over election matters. And I spend a lot of my time covering our state legislature. They go away, they finish their work, and then the lawsuits all start. There are a lot of them that are still in stream. In fact, we have 2 of the races from 2022 that are still in court. The losers are still contesting their losses, and the courts have not had the final say on that yet, but I don't think they're going to win the governor's seat or the attorney general's seat, but they're making their point in court. And also, we get pulled into things like the audit. After 2020, for viewers, there was the vote for president in Arizona was very, very narrow. Biden won by 10,000 plus votes statewide. And it was the vote that swung this state and a couple others, swung the presidency to Biden. Well, the Trump forces, came in, thought they had a friendly Republican legislature that they could work with, and try to take a really hard look at those electoral results. There were efforts to try to get them to replace the duly elected electors. That didn't work. What they came up with is this audit where they were able to get all 2 million ballots that voters in Maricopa County cast for in 2020. And they were going to basically recount the votes for president and for U.S. Senate. And that created a whole nother beat, a whole nother assignment for a bunch of reporters that went on. I mean, actually, we're still doing stories that relate to the audit. I was brought into it late, and unfortunately, it was summer, and the audit had moved into a warehouse that only had swamp cooling, so it was very hot. And I had spent many, many hours standing in a very sweaty, not very well cooled building, watching people recount these ballots and then feed them through a paper counting machine to make sure that they even just counted the right number of ballots. So who knew that this would be part of covering, democracy and how it's carried out? But we've got to be ready for odd things like that cropping up.
Mary Jo, I would really echo that coverage of how elections work is a really, really big change since 2020, and a really important one, and one of the values of news outlets like yours that are trusted and there for both the before and after the election, because it's really hard to explain how elections work and build trust with people when it's in the moment, when tensions are high and kind of the stakes feel high, but you can do that work over the course of years getting ready for an election and then follow up. And so I appreciate that. The one thing I would add is, to reinforce that resources continue to shrink. And one of the things that kind of the new nonprofit news organizations are doing in partnership with legacy newspapers and other media is really kind of working together in collaboration. And so, one of the stories I like to tell from our portfolio is Spotlight PA, which is a statewide news outlet, a nonprofit serving Pennsylvania. And they have 100+ distribution partners across the state. So when they put together their voting guides for the Commonwealth courts, which are, if you're following national news, you probably saw coverage of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which had a really important election last week. Most of the interest in Pennsylvania was around the Commonwealth courts, because that is closer to more communities and it impacts more people's lives. And that's where the attention was. And they have 100 distribution partners, community newspapers and weeklies in every corner of the state that have access to this kind of information through these partnerships and collaborations. And that's something that is new over 4 years ago, which is, I think, really exciting for kind of how our democracy functions too.
We could use some partners like that, like in a state like Arizona, which is geographically, it's big, and basically all the news outlets are in the Phoenix, Maricopa County area. We are now spending more time focusing on what's going on with the election process in the out counties, way out there, on the far reaches of the desert. In fact, last year we had one county board of supervisors that was intending to not certify the results of the 2022 election, which led to litigation. And actually that's still not quite all put to bed. So there's the imperative to take a look, outside of your immediate coverage area and look at places that perhaps have always flown under the radar.
Something else I'd add that I noticed this election season that seems different to me is that I think that some of the gatekeeping around who runs for office has sort of collapsed. The party structures that used to sort of say, yeah, you know what, you've got a previous conviction for tax evasion. We don't think you'd probably be a great candidate to represent our party. I don't know how much of that even happens now. Like, we just had so many candidates that had troublesome backgrounds that frankly required, some real reporting to dig out. I'm thinking in particular of a candidate who ran for a county office in one of our counties who had done federal jail time for tax evasion, and nobody knew this. This is a guy who ran a very respectable business here, and then when we asked him about it, we quoted him going on quite a tirade about what a terrorist organization the IRS is and how they were harassing his family, and that he had done nothing wrong, despite the fact that he I believe, if I remember right, he had actually pleaded guilty, and then he had done prison time in federal prison. I mean, like, there's so many more of those kinds of stories that require a lot of checking. It's just a whole new wrinkle compared to my prior experience covering elections.
Did that guy win?
He did not win.
Well,
but
that's sort of to the point, isn't it, about the role of journalism in democracy?
I can tell you this, there were enough of those kinds of candidates that we had to make decisions about which ones we could do the deep dives on and which ones we really couldn't. You know, like we would have to decide, like, this one we think is a very real candidate and has a good chance of winning. This one we think has no chance of winning. Let's invest our resources in the one that's more competitive. I mean, it's just crazy to me that we're making choices like that.
Another change, as I was thinking about it, again, our 2022 elections, which were statewide, they were rather contentious, and at times the newsroom would send people out in teams. They didn't want a reporter going out alone, so pair up with the photographer and go out. Nobody had any physical threats, but there was that possibility. The rhetoric was that heated, that in certain circumstances, we made sure that we didn't send anybody out solo.
Can I add to that? I had a conversation with an editor literally today about the threats against one of our reporters. Well, threats is too strong a word, but the repeated attacks online against one of our reporters and like how to manage it. This is also something that's just like new and different. And it really does, it affects our ability to confidently say, yes, we're going to write another story about that, even though the last time we wrote about it, like, people said things like there's a special place in hell for that reporter and stuff like that online.
I mean, with resources also, then how do you even physically protect reporters? And, you know, we're seeing it also with election workers and the threats, and it's just the whole system is, anyone who's there to do a job is under attack.
I mean, I'm worried about it. I'm sitting here in my office that has no back door, and we have a sweet retired woman who sits at the front desk. And like, I have worried about how we would protect ourselves in an incident. I think it's just something that I did not think about day to day in 95% of my journalism career, but you have to think about now.
Yeah, I'm talking from our building where everything is, you know, badge secured. You can't get past the security guard, you know, unless you have someone come down to escort you and, you know, go through the stiles. It's a different world, but still a worthy pursuit. And I'm very much looking forward to the 2024 elections.
Yeah, thank you for doing it, because as we're talking about it, obviously it's so critical to our country. We can kind of go to the next question. You know, we're talking a lot about local and national news and the different roles maybe that each can play in election coverage. How can local news stories influence the national narrative around elections and candidates? And how does the increase of news deserts impact local news coverage of elections? And maybe we'll start with Jason and then go to Scott on this one. And then you, Mary Jo, after.
I like this question a lot. You know, I think in a lot of ways national narratives are built on local news, at least kind of as you look back, you know, over the years. You know, what's happening in local communities, if you have better and more information about that, and better and more information about what communities need and what people are interested in, that can help shape those local narratives. So strong, robust local newsrooms are where national reporters look to understand what's going on. National reporters are reading, you know, Mary Jo's newsrooms reporting and paying attention to what Scott and his team are doing in Virginia to understand what Virginia thinks going into elections and coming out of elections. So I think that's one way that local news really, you don't see it all the time if you're just paying attention to national news, but the information in those national narratives, it really comes down to folks on the ground, reporters paying attention and really knowing their communities and knowing what's going on. The other one, though, is the one I really like, and it's local news that's built trust with communities can offer solutions and kind of empower readers. So I think at the local level, there's an ability for local news to act as kind of an antidote to apathy. I think, national narratives, especially right now, feel like nothing can get fixed and kind of systems are broken. At the local level, there's a chance for local news to start to highlight solutions and highlight what's working and show that we can, as a community, come together and fix things. And I think that can actually, shift some of that national narrative too, when we have more examples of where things are going well at the local level. And people, I think, really do think generally things are going better in their local, for themselves in their local towns and communities than they think things are going on the national level. So having really good local news kind of changes, I think, how people read into national narratives as well.
Yeah, I would say the connection between the national narrative and local politics is just stronger than it's ever been. We, for example, broke a story during this election season about a outside group that was hanging door hangers on people's doors that were, like, frankly threatening. It basically said if you did not vote. So the goal was to turn out conservative voters in the district, the local districts here, by putting these door hangers on that said stuff like, you must vote in the election or you can lose your Social Security benefits, stuff like that. So we heard about it and we started looking into the hangers and where they came from. And it turned out they were connected to a DC-based national group that was run by a former Trump campaign official. And what was most fascinating was we as we tracked that down and looked at the group, like, we looked at their own website, which very explicitly said it was trying to use Virginia as a test run for pressure. This is all words from their website, for pressure tactics to turn out the conservative base, right? So, like, our local elections right here were a testing ground for a national group that was trying to find ways to turn out conservative voters for 2024. That was the whole goal of it. So the connection between the national story and local elections is really strong sometimes.
I don't have a whole lot to add, except that I do agree that, often it's the local coverage that sets the baseline, which will bring in the reporters from other outlets. I mean, the Washington Post now has a Phoenix-based reporter. That never happened before. And that was driven, a lot by local events, but you wouldn't know about those local events unless the local media was writing about them and broadcasting about them.
This is just a bit of a follow-up, just thinking about kind of the ideas of how conspiracy theories and misinformation is circulated. And as, a reporter in a community, some of the research that we've discovered with Ad Council, is that local reporters are the ones who are in the position to combat that information. And I'm just curious about how, if you found yourself in that role and have been able to kind of put a check on the disinformation or misinformation and to kind of roll it back, if you see that as, part of your role as a journalist, and kind of what tools you use to do that very type of work. Sorry, I Mary Jo, maybe start with you and then to Scott or whoever feels ready to chime in.
Well, yes, yeah, you got to jump on the disinformation, now more so than ever. We were even talking in our staff meeting earlier today about maybe even the need to, like, pre-bunk some things. Things that we know, at least in the past, that, like, the machines aren't rigged that tabulate the ballots. But it's it's really important to get that out there. Another way to do that, you give people their say, but do the what they call the truth sandwich, where you start off with a statement of fact, then you sort of in the middle you talk about candidate X, campaign Y that said this thing that's untrue, and then you follow up explaining why that is not the case, referencing back to your first paragraph. But it's important to do that pretty quickly and sort of call it for what it is, to show there aren't, to challenge candidates and campaigns to provide the evidence for what they're alleging.
Let me add something here. So I do. I mean, of course, I would say doing the journalism as I just described, like that story was exactly what you're suggesting, which is, we learned about this, we did the work, we were able to explain that it was misinformation and where it was coming from, and I think that did help voters in our area understand it better. But let me compliment the AJP and some of the other large organizations in the nonprofit space. Having been in that space for the last 10 years, one of the things that I think has been a good development is sort of the nonprofit ethos, which has nudged journalists to be more connected to their readers, to seek more interaction with their readers, more feedback, in-person interaction, online interaction. That's been a good development, I think, in the news business. Even in my little place, I respond to every email and I will take people's phone calls. And that, to me, especially when you're talking about a little bit more small scale news operation like mine, makes a really big difference. Like I had a person call me or they emailed me and they were angry because we had described one candidate as a cowboy hat wearing Republican who works as a consultant. And he was mad because, first of all, we called him cowboy hat wearing. And secondly, we said he was a consultant and not CEO of a company. He is the CEO of his mom and dad's company. It's he and mom and dad, and he's the CEO. So, I just talked to the person and I was like, well, so other people complained about the cowboy hat description, but I was like, I don't understand the criticism. Like, it is the biggest piece of his branding. It's on he wears the hat all the time. It's on his own like signs and stuff. I'm like, he wants you to know he is cowboy hat wearing. Like, I don't see how that's criticism from us. Like, if anything, we're advancing his branding for him. And then like the consulting thing I actually thought was a fair point. Like, could we have first described him as a CEO and then said, he's a CEO of a consulting firm? That we probably could have. I thought I'd explained our thinking. Our thinking is to describe the work that he does, not just the role. Like, his actual work is consulting. That's why we describe him as consultant. And also, I don't understand how that, like, she called that insulting. I was like, I don't think it's insulting to describe someone by their work. Anyway, I ended up in this very nice back and forth, which ended with this person saying, asking if I'm in the office, said they'd love to come in and chat with me sometime and thanking me for answering their questions. Like, I really think those kinds of interactions really do help people to like see us as people, understand the challenges, understand we're trying hard to describe the guy in a way that gets people to see who he is. So that's one thing I think is actually better. Thanks to the influence, I think, of the nonprofit news sort of movement.
Yeah, I think a lot of our work that CLC has done on this is trying to figure out who do the audiences we want to reach really trust. And it's always about relationship building and what you're describing. And it comes down to election workers and to journalists who they know. And so that's exactly why I think local news is increasingly going to be turned to more and more, which is a wonderful thing. Just one last question before I turn it to questions from those watching today. How do newsrooms navigate the current political environment as you report on elections, both in terms of which stories you choose to cover and how you go about covering them? Scott, we can start with you.
I mean, I think the single hardest thing is is not letting the folks who are ill-willed suck all the oxygen out of everything. You know what I mean? Like, you have to sort of, not get yourself deep into the mud of a debate with somebody who you can recognize as like, it's not a goodwill conversation. It's not a genuine effort to reach an understanding about the issues. It's a gotcha, or it's an effort to sort of like confuse or throw sand in the gears. Like, that's really hard because you don't, again, I just got done saying, engage people and like listen to them and converse with them. But also you have to know when to like not invest too much energy if you get the sense that this person is not trying to be a productive and helpful conversant in the public discourse. So that's something I think is probably like a hard thing to manage through, and something you have to you have to check yourself on pretty regularly in especially in the small local news market.
Yeah, I would say we hear often from people who say, well, you're not covering my campaign, and but my opponent's getting all this attention. And first of all, we don't run campaigns. The candidates run their campaigns. So it's up to them to make the case for why we should be covering things. But if you're just out there to have your name on the ballot and you're just doing a little bit of nominal work, or maybe none, that doesn't merit coverage. We've got a lot of other things to do. And also we try, obviously, like Scott mentioned, all the backgrounding that they've done on candidates. Oh my goodness, whatever that turns up, that's an important thing to report out in the proper context. So that drives it. And then of course issues, where people stand on issues and how their rhetoric might match up with what they're purporting to stand for. It can be difficult, but it's really important, and the media always fails at this, but it's really important to not buy so much into the horse race, who's ahead today, what this or that poll shows. There's a lot of, I think, should be skepticism about polls, and also a misunderstanding that polls are snapshots in time. They're not predictors of the future, but that's how they're regarded. And I know in our newsroom we're having some conversations now about how much polling we should really rely on for our coverage, and instead do a lot more grassroots work on issues and candidates.
A final thought on that, Mary Jo. Just a lot of this to me comes down to putting the community first. What's the community looking for in this coverage? Ask them, tell them what you heard from asking them, and then let that kind of shape and drive your coverage, and bring your community into what you're doing and why. Because I think communities really have a really good sense of what they need to navigate elections and to navigate election season and to be kind of part of their democracies. I think newsrooms that build the habit of opening up with their audiences are really successful.
Really good point. Well, I think we have some questions from those who have been tuning in. And so are there any questions that are coming in? It looks like we have the first one. Has the notion of objectivity been challenged in reporting on people who are trying to undermine American institutions, whether election deniers or an anti-IRS candidate mentioned?
I'm struggling a little bit to understand the question. So this is what I think they're talking about is if you focus a lot of attention, for example, on, let's just pick one party. Like if there are 3 Democratic candidates and they all 3 have, those kind of troublesome legal history backgrounds, and you're writing deep dives on their problems, does it seem like you're anti that party? I think that's maybe what they're getting at. And I do think that that's a challenge. Like we sometimes do face that. Like, why are you spending so much energy on that candidate? Like, it seems like you're really trying to defeat them. And it's like, no, actually, we're just really trying to tell you all that you need to know about what's in their background. But that does crop up. The cowboy hat wearing guy that I talked about, there were definitely people who thought the amount of coverage we did of that particular race out of the 5 in our county suggested some kind of bias. And I'm like, again, just in conversation, you have to try to get them to see, like, actually, it was just a race of particular interest and importance and very competitive. And that's why we're there,
I think maybe the question also gets to the notion of, well, should you be providing a platform for somebody who's, saying that the Dominion, voting machines switched all the ballots over to Biden? Are you elevating them by writing about that? that claim and promoting what they're promoting. And that's a balance. I think there's a reason to write about it, but again, you've got to, sort of sandwich that in with, where the facts are. And that's where the quote unquote objectivity comes in. I mean, obviously objectivity is often in the eye of the beholder. I can't tell you how many people, some people read the title of our newspaper, the Arizona Republic, and we have progressives and Democrats who think that we are basically an organ of the Republican Party, and we have Republicans who just loathe the fact that the word republic's, in our title. A lot of people, they always view the news through their own lens, and when you're telling them something that doesn't comport with what they see, you're going to get pushed back.
Next question. Any advice on helping voters understand that they can hold politicians accountable?
Well, the main thing is, you can vote. There are also, I'm sure in many states, recall provisions. There are ways to petition them, to show up at their events, to write to them, to do some kind of social media campaign. But the best way for citizens to have recourse and to hold people accountable is by their vote.
I'll say this, an encouraging and heartening thing for me in this campaign was I did see quite a lot of participation in public settings. For example, we sponsored a candidates night for one of our big races for 5 candidates for countywide offices. And there were lots of people there. I mean, there were a few hundred people that showed up and lots of questions from the audience. I moderated and I came away feeling very good about that. Like, I think there are a lot of good signs that more than I think people give it credit for, people do participate, and that is a good way to hold folks accountable.
We talk a lot with our grantee partners about just telling the story about their impact and how local news makes a difference. And if you look at any of the organizations that we work with over the last 6 or 12 months, story after story after story of where someone in the community has brought something to the newsroom's attention, the newsroom has helped elevate those questions, elevate those issues, look into a solution, and something happens. Like, this is a way that we can fix problems. And part of that is holding elected officials accountable. So I think that's really a core function of local news, and one of the really exciting parts about rebuilding local news in more communities.
Thank you. Next question. Are any of you finding the inexperience in local newsrooms at odds with quality, unbiased journalism that then feeds national media? And if so, do you see a role for education and workforce investments to fund training for proximate leaders to do good journalism?
Let me happily take this question. In a prior life, I was the president of the National Education Writers Association. This was a group that, with foundation support primarily, provided all sorts of training and learning for journalists of all types, print, radio, online only, whatever, to learn about the very complicated issues of education. So when I was president of that group, I used to tell people, this group raised me as a journalist. Like, I learned how to do my job by going to their trainings and participating and meeting my other reporters who cover what I cover, and building my own network of people I could call the guy in Texas and say, hey, I've got a cheating school. I saw you did an award-winning story about that. How do I do that? I think that is just critical. I do have young and inexperienced reporters, and we spend a lot of our work time like just helping them learn, helping them navigate some of the first time through an election or through this kind of thing, like the online criticism thing, for example, helping them to understand how to manage that and how not to worry too much about it. Like, it's just like a really big piece of what's happening at the smaller, sort of what you might call the entry level news organizations, which is what mine is.
A very quick addition, because I'm so excited about this. This conversation, like local news and democracy, what that also means is like people who really care about these things are excited to go work in local newsrooms. and that hasn't always been the case. Sometimes local news has been kind of a stepping stone to national platforms. Across our portfolio, we're seeing really, really good reporters, really, really good editors want to come serve their communities through doing local news. And that's, I think, something to look forward to. It's because it does matter to have really, really good people. And there's an opportunity. There's going to be a lot more jobs for young reporters in local news.
Thank you. That is really exciting to know that people are drawn to this work because they see how important it is. The last question that we'll take today, because we're coming up on time, we almost have less than a year till the next presidential election in America. What needs to be done to avoid the same problems we've seen in 2020, and how can the media help in this process? Great, last question.
Well, I think the organizations that are supported by the American Journalism Project are already investing in voter education, explaining how elections work, doing fact briefs on things that matter to their communities. They're putting resources there, and I think what can we do is continue to find and support the local newsrooms that are doing this work really well in your communities wherever you are. And support them in doing it, and that's how we, at least that's how the local news that we're all working on has a role to prevent something happening in 2024 that happened in 2020.
Yeah, I echo that. I mean, everything we talked about earlier, like doing more coverage and really education on the electoral process, how it works. How when you take your sealed ballot in an envelope, your ballot sealed in an envelope, and drop it off at a polling station or in a mailbox or in a drop box, what the data shows on the confidence level that your vote is being counted. In Maricopa County, and they're trying to bring this statewide, there is a program now that I just did this for a local election. I had to mail my ballot in. And 3 days later, I got a text message from the local county elections office saying your ballot's been received. And like 2 days after that, I got a note saying it was processed and sent on. They don't know how you voted, but they can confirm that your ballot has arrived and it's been processed. And that helps do that. And there is going to be an effort to expand that to all counties across Arizona, which, and again, there will be people who won't trust it, but it does make you feel better to get basically a receipt knowing that your mailed-in ballot arrived.
And I would just add, I mean, I think that after the last two presidential election cycles, we all know that we can't take democracy for granted. And I do think we mostly did. Most of my life, I just don't think there was much debate about whether you could trust your election system and whether you could trust two parties to work together for the betterment of the country and of democracy in general. And I think we all know now in the media and everywhere else that you just can't take for granted that can occur and will occur, and that something terrible can't happen. So given that, I do think, I mean, I detected better vigilance among my colleagues in the media in the last 10 years in elections, increasingly over that time. I hope I'm right. That I think that we're all working harder than we ever did to ensure trust in the elections.
Yeah, thank you. Before we close our conversation, just wanted to, give everyone on the panel, a chance to have some final thoughts, offer, what influence journalists covering this election carry on voters and democracy. And, if you have any parting words, maybe start with Mary Jo. Oh, on you.
Yeah, well, shameless plug, but follow our coverage. I mean, Arizona has, is pivotal to the presidential race, at least as it's shaping up right now. We have a potentially three-way U.S. Senate race, which will have great import on the leanings of the Senate. and we have some very competitive legislative races. So, you can always follow us on azcentral.com. And I would welcome anybody listening to this who has ideas or suggestions, critiques. Reach out to us. I'm at Mary J. Pitzel on social media, and you can find my email address on the AZ Central website.
I'd also just say, be hopeful. We hear a lot of doom and gloom about the media and the challenges facing the industry. And while, you usually see numbers for how many print newspapers have disappeared and that sort of thing. But also remember, there's a really fast-growing, online-only, nonprofit-driven sector that's new and interesting and bringing a lot of innovation to the space. And I tell people I'm actually more optimistic about the future of media now than I was even 5 years ago. So try to be optimistic and embrace some of the new types of models and new approaches that are coming forward. And again, Jason's group is one of the big players in that space, but there are several good players out there who really are creating innovative approaches to doing stuff like covering elections that are making a really positive difference for the journalistic work.
This has been a lot of fun to be in conversation with you, Sandhya, and Mary Jo and Scott on this. I think I would wrap it up this way from where I sit, at least, that local news is in my mind, uniquely able to move the needle on these kind of indicators of democratic health that ultimately we look at and we care about. It can move the needle on partisanship, on civic engagement, on voting rates. And it's exciting that there are far more reporters in nonprofit local newsrooms now than there were 4 years ago, and that this is a story about what's going to happen over the next 12 months. But it's really a story about what we are going to do as a community, kind of we the people, to rebuild and reinvest and repair local news over the next, the next cycle and the cycle after that, to rebuild, all of these things that really matter to us for kind of a strong democratic society and local communities.
Thank you all. I mean, you all are heroes for preserving our democracy. Truly, I can't not thank you enough for all the work that you're doing, especially given what you're facing while you're doing it. So thank you. And thank you for being here today to have this conversation. It was really fun and interesting. For those in the audience, if you have additional questions for our panelists or would like more information, of course, email us at info@campaignlegalcenter.org. And again, thank you to all of our panelists, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.